The year is 1869. In the dense, fog-choked hollows of eastern Kentucky, a promise is sealed not with a kiss, but with a scream that is swallowed by the ancient woods. The place is known as Blackwood Chapel, a grim edifice of dark, river-smoothed stone, erected as a monument to one man's grief and destined to become a tomb for the hopes of many. Its steeple does not so much reach for heaven as it does stab at the bruised, twilight sky. Tonight, a wedding is meant to take place. The groom, a young farmer named Silas, stands at the altar, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the vestry door from which his bride, Alara Vance, was supposed to emerge 10 minutes ago. But the door remains closed. The silence in the chapel is no longer reverent. It is heavy, suffocating, thick with an unspoken dread that clings to the air like the damp chill of the grave. The few gathered guests, family and close friends, shift in the hard wooden pews, their whispers turning from anxious to fearful. The Reverend Alastair Blackwood, the chapel's architect and minister, steps out from the vestry, his face a mask of solemn concern. He announces that Alara is not there. She has, it would seem, vanished. The word hangs in the air, a horrifying, impossible notion. How could a woman in a full, white wedding gown simply disappear from a sealed room in a chapel miles from any real road, surrounded on all sides by an impassable forest? The search begins immediately, a frantic, desperate affair lit by the flickering orange of lanterns against the encroaching dark. They search the chapel, the woods, the creek bed. They find nothing. No note, no tracks, no sign of a struggle. It is as if the very earth, or perhaps the chapel itself, opened its stone jaws and consumed her whole. This is the first bride claimed by the chapel. It is the beginning of a dark and forbidden Kentucky legend, a cold case that would curdle the blood and baffle investigators for generations. A tale of a place so cursed, it was eventually banned from use, its story buried under layers of fear and time, deemed too macabre for the history books. To understand the horrifying legacy of Blackwood Chapel, one must first understand the man who built it. Reverend Alastair Blackwood arrived in the remote community of Ashen Creek in 1865, a man hollowed out by the Civil War and the personal tragedy of losing his beloved wife to consumption. He was a figure of profound sorrow, yet he possessed a magnetic, almost hypnotic charisma. He spoke of God not with fire and brimstone, but with a quiet, melancholic poetry that resonated with a populace weary of death and loss. He told them he had been called to this isolated valley to build a sanctuary, a place of peace dedicated to the memory of his lost love, a chapel where new lives could begin, shielded from the sorrows of the world he knew so well. The townsfolk, moved by his story and charmed by his eloquence, donated the land and their labor. Blackwood himself oversaw every detail of the construction. He chose the site, a secluded clearing deep in the oldest part of the forest, a place the local Cherokee had long avoided, whispering that the ground there was sour. He insisted on using a specific type of dark, gray stone, quarried from the bed of the nearby Shadow Creek, stone that seemed to drink the light and remain perpetually cold to the touch. The chapel's design was his own, a strange and unsettling blend of Gothic austerity and primitive, almost pagan, simplicity. The windows were too narrow, the nave too long, the bell in its tower cast to a note that was not joyful but mournful and dissonant, a sound that seemed to carry a warning on the wind. The locals murmured amongst themselves about the oddities of the construction. They spoke of Blackwood's habit of working late into the night, alone, mixing the mortar and laying the stones of the foundation with an obsessive, almost feverish intensity. They didn't know that with every stone he laid, he was building more than a house of God. He was forging a monument to his own fractured psyche, a place where his twisted grief could take root. He was creating a trap. And Alara Vance, the beautiful, trusting daughter of a local blacksmith, was about to become its first victim. Alara Vance was everything a young bride in post-war Kentucky could hope to be, radiant, kind-hearted, and deeply in love. Her betrothal to Silas Croft was the talk of Ashen Creek, a small beacon of hope in a community still scarred by conflict. Their wedding was to be the first ever held in the newly consecrated Blackwood Chapel, an honor bestowed upon them by the Reverend himself, who saw in their union a perfect, symbolic christening for his sanctuary. In the weeks leading up to the ceremony, Alara spent a great deal of time with Reverend Blackwood for spiritual counseling, a common practice at the time. Those who saw them spoke of the Reverend's paternal affection for the young woman, how his usual melancholic demeanor seemed to lift in her presence. He called her a flower blooming in a field of sorrow. No one saw the darkness lurking behind his gentle eyes, the possessive, predatory nature of his gaze. On the day of her wedding, October 31st, 1869, Alara arrived at the chapel, a vision in a simple, handmade lace gown. She was nervous, but her smile was incandescent. She was escorted to the vestry, the small room at the back of the chapel, to await the ceremony. Her mother, Martha Vance, was the last to see her. She helped her daughter adjust her veil, kissed her cheek, and told her she would see her at the altar. Martha later recounted that as she was leaving the room, the Reverend Blackwood entered, closing the door quietly behind him. He had a small, reassuring smile on his face. He was there, he said, to offer the bride a final prayer to calm her nerves before she took her vows. That was the last moment anyone ever saw Alara Vance alive. The 10 minutes that followed were filled with the soft, expectant strains of a pump organ. Then those minutes stretched into 15, then 20. The music faltered. The groom's hopeful expression curdled into one of confusion, then alarm. The door to the vestry, the only exit besides a small, barred window high on the wall, remained shut. A horrifying, impossible reality was beginning to dawn. Alara was gone. The initial search for Alara Vance was a study in chaos and disbelief. Silas Croft, her intended husband, was inconsolable, his mind refusing to process the situation. He and Alara's father, a man of immense physical strength, nearly tore the vestry apart looking for a hidden door, a loose floorboard, any logical explanation for the impossible. They found nothing. The room was a simple, stone-walled box. A small table, a mirror, and a single wooden chair were its only furnishings. The room's only window was barely a foot wide, covered with a thick iron grate that was rusted firmly into the stone frame. The heavy oak door had been closed, but not locked. Reverend Blackwood, for his part, appeared just as baffled and distraught as everyone else. He recounted his final moments with Alara, his voice trembling with emotion. He said he had offered a brief prayer, blessed her, and then left her for her final moments of quiet contemplation. He claimed he had then gone to his small office on the other side of the chapel to retrieve his sermon book, only to return when the organist alerted him to the delay. His story was plausible, his grief seemingly genuine. Who would ever suspect the man of God? As the search spilled out into the darkening woods, the raw panic of the wedding party infected the small community. Men from Ashen Creek arrived with torches and hunting dogs. They combed the forest in ever-widening circles around the chapel, their calls of Alara echoing unanswered through the gnarled, skeletal trees. The dogs, normally expert trackers, were strangely agitated, whining and refusing to pick up a scent near the chapel walls, as if the very stone repelled them. They found no footprints leading away from the building, no torn piece of her lace dress, not a single trace of her passage. It was a vanishing act so perfect, so complete, it felt less like a human act and more like a dark miracle. The law, in the form of the aging and overwhelmed Sheriff Brody, arrived the next day. He conducted his interviews, took his notes, and ultimately concluded that the young bride must have had a last-minute change of heart and somehow, inexplicably, slipped away into the wilderness. It was a deeply unsatisfying explanation, one that nobody, least of all her heartbroken family, truly believed. The creepy tale began to take root. The chapel itself was hungry. In the aftermath of Alara Vance's disturbing disappearance, a pall of suspicion and fear fell over Ashen Creek. Fingers were pointed, first in whispers, then in open accusation. Silas Croft, the grieving groom, was the first to fall under the community's distrustful gaze. Had he and Alara argued? Did he have a secret, a violent temper hidden behind his quiet demeanor? Sheriff Brody questioned him for hours, but the young man's story never wavered, and his anguish was too profound to be faked. The investigation soon turned to strangers, drifters or vagrants who might have been passing through the area, though no evidence of any such person ever surfaced. The theory of a wild animal attack was briefly considered and then dismissed. The lack of any blood or torn clothing made it impossible. With every logical avenue exhausted, the community turned to the illogical, the supernatural. The old whispers about the land the chapel was built on resurfaced with a vengeance. Elders spoke of the sour ground, a place where the earth held onto sorrow and didn't let go. They recounted forgotten tales of strange disappearances in that part of the forest long before the chapel was ever conceived. The creepy structure of dark stone became the focal point of their dread. People began calling it the Chapel of Tears. They noted how the shadows seemed to cling to it, even at midday, how the wind seemed to moan a mournful tune as it passed through the narrow windows. Reverend Blackwood fueled these nascent fears, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps not. He spoke in his sermons of a world where evil was a tangible force, where darkness could sometimes overwhelm the light. He never called the chapel cursed, not in so many words, but he described the event as a horrifying trial of faith, a macabre test from an unseen world. He held a memorial service for Ilara that felt more like an exorcism, praying for the consecration of the ground and the protection of his flock. The chapel was closed for a full year. The silence and abandonment only served to deepen its macabre reputation. It stood alone in the woods, a silent, brooding monument to a question that had no answer. Where did Ilara go? For 6 years, Blackwood Chapel remained mostly unused. Its stone walls became slick with moss, and its bell tower fell silent. The memory of Ilara Vance's vanishing became a chilling piece of local folklore, a ghost story told to frighten children and warn courting couples away from the woods after dark. The Reverend Blackwood continued his ministry, holding services in a makeshift space in town. He aged noticeably in those years, his sorrowful demeanor deepening until it seemed permanently etched onto his face. He never remarried, presenting himself as a man wedded to his grief and his God. He tended to the chapel grounds himself, a solitary caretaker for a forsaken place, ensuring the weeds never grew too high, the path never fully disappeared. He told the townsfolk it was his sacred duty to maintain the site, to keep a vigil for the lost soul of Ilara. Then in the spring of 1875, a new family, the O'Connells, moved to Ashen Creek. They were prosperous merchants from Louisville, seeking the peace of the countryside. Their eldest daughter, Martha, was a vibrant and headstrong young woman, engaged to a promising young lawyer. Unburdened by the local history and superstitions, Martha was captivated by the chapel's strange, melancholy beauty. She saw it not as a place of horror, but as one of romantic Gothic tragedy. Against the strenuous objections of the locals, she declared that she would be married in Blackwood Chapel. She believed that a joyful celebration of love was the only thing that could cleanse the building of its sad memories. Her parents, eager to please their determined daughter, appealed directly to Reverend Blackwood. At first he refused. He spoke of the unhealed wound and the shadow that still lingered there. But Martha O'Connell was persuasive, and her father's donation to the church was substantial. With a display of great reluctance and solemnity, the Reverend finally agreed, stating that perhaps it was indeed God's will to bring light back to that forsaken place. The date was set. A new bride was coming to the chapel. The people of Ashen Creek watched the preparations with a collective sense of dread, a feeling that they were about to witness a horrifying history repeat itself. They were right. The wedding of Martha O'Connell was a far grander affair than Ilara Vance's had been. The O'Connells were wealthy, and they were determined to chase away the chapel's ghosts with a sheer display of opulence and cheer. They had the dark stone walls scrubbed, the pews polished, and the nave filled with hundreds of white lilies, whose cloying, funereal scent did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere. The guests were mostly friends and family from the city, fashionable people who viewed the local tales of a curse as quaint, rustic nonsense. They laughed and drank fine whiskey on the chapel lawn, their bright clothing a stark contrast to the grim, gray backdrop of the building and the dark, watchful woods. Sheriff Brody, now older and closer to retirement, was present not as a guest, but as a precaution. He felt a deep, gnawing unease, a sense of horrible déjà vu that he couldn't shake. He watched as Martha, radiant in an expensive silk and pearl gown, arrived in a fine carriage. He watched Reverend Blackwood greet her with that same gentle, paternal smile he had given Alara 6 years prior. The procedure was hauntingly familiar. The bride was led to the vestry to await the ceremony. Her younger sister, Clara, stayed with her for a few moments, helping with her veil. Clara would later testify that the Reverend entered the room just as before to offer a private prayer. He kindly asked her to leave to give the bride a moment of peace before the service began. Clara hesitated, a sudden, inexplicable chill running down her spine, but the Reverend's smile was disarming, his presence calming. She curtsied and left, closing the heavy door behind her. The organ began to play. 5 minutes passed. 10. A dreadful, stomach-churning silence began to fall over the expectant crowd. The groom's smile faltered. Sheriff Brody felt his blood run cold. He pushed his way through the guests, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He didn't wait for an announcement. He threw open the vestry door. The room was empty. The scent of lilies and dread hung in the air. The small, barred window was untouched. Martha O'Connell, like Alara Vance before her, had vanished without a trace. The curse was real. The disappearance of a second bride, this time the daughter of a wealthy and influential family, ignited a firestorm of panic and outrage that the vanishing of a simple blacksmith's daughter never had. The O'Connell family brought in their own investigators from Louisville, Pinkerton detectives, famous for their relentless pursuit of criminals. Ashen Creek was suddenly swarmed with outsiders, reporters and grim-faced men in bowler hats who questioned everyone and treated the local superstitions with contempt. They mapped the area, interrogated the Reverend Blackwood for days, and cross-examined every guest. They tore the vestry apart, this time with scientific precision, ripping up floorboards and sounding the stone walls for hollow spaces. Their search was meticulous, logical, and ultimately fruitless. They found absolutely nothing. The chapel offered up no clues. It was a perfect, hermetically sealed crime scene with no crime to be found. The Pinkertons, accustomed to solving train robberies and tracking down outlaws, were completely stumped by the impossible physics of the situation. How does a grown woman disappear from a sealed room? Their official report concluded, much like Sheriff Brody's 6 years earlier, that Martha must have orchestrated her own disappearance, slipping away in the brief, unobserved moments before the ceremony. But this theory made even less sense than it did for Alara. Martha was deeply in love, excited for her future, and had no reason to flee. Furthermore, her elaborate silk gown would have made any trek through the dense, thorny woods nearly impossible without leaving a significant trail of evidence. Yet not a single thread of silk, not a single pearl from her dress was ever found. As the professional investigation stalled, the local horror intensified. The chapel was no longer just a place of sorrow. It was a place of active, malevolent hunger. The story of the Kentucky bride-taker became a national sensation, a macabre piece of news that fascinated and terrified readers across the country. And the community of Ashen Creek, now living in the shadow of a national horror story, made a collective decision. The chapel was declared unholy. It was banned. No more services, no more weddings, no more prayers would ever be offered within its cold, dark stone walls. The official ban on Blackwood Chapel did little to quell the mounting terror. It only cemented its status as a forbidden place, a magnet for dark legends. The building was boarded up, its path deliberately allowed to become overgrown, an attempt by the community to erase it from sight and from memory. But such places are never truly forgotten. They fester in the collective imagination. The chapel became the subject of the most horrifying local folklore. It was said that on the anniversary of each disappearance, a mournful bell could be heard tolling from the silent tower. Once for each year the brides had been gone. People claimed to see a faint, flickering light in the barred vestry window on moonless nights, the ghost of a bride eternally waiting. Hunters and travelers who ventured too close to the clearing reported a sudden, unnatural cold, a sense of being watched by unseen eyes, and the sound of a woman weeping softly on the wind. Reverend Blackwood, now the pastor of a cursed and abandoned church, became an object of pity and morbid fascination. He seemed to shrink into himself, a man broken by the double tragedy that had befallen his sanctuary. He maintained his vigil, often seen walking the overgrown path to the chapel, where he would stand outside the boarded-up doors for hours, head bowed in silent prayer. His devotion was seen by some as a profound act of faith and remorse. To others, it was deeply creepy. Why did he remain so attached to a place of such horror? Why hadn't he left Ashen Creek years ago? The questions hung in the air, unanswered. The stories of the vanished brides became a cautionary tale whispered across Kentucky and beyond. The macabre details, the sealed room, the lack of any evidence, turned it from a simple cold case into something far more disturbing, a genuine American mystery on par with the Roanoke colony. And as the years turned into decades, the truth of what happened in that chapel became hopelessly entangled with the legend, buried deeper and deeper under a layer of supernatural dread. The real horror, the human horror, was being forgotten. If you find yourself drawn to these forbidden histories, these stories that hide in the dark, corners of the past, consider subscribing to our channel. Because the attempt to uncover the truth, which came years later, would lead to a discovery even more horrifying than the curse itself. By 1888, nearly 2 decades after the first disappearance, the story of the Blackwood Chapel had hardened into a permanent and monstrous legend. The building itself was now a ruin. The roof had begun to sag, and ivy crawled over the dark stones like skeletal fingers, slowly pulling the cursed place back into the earth. Most of the residents of Ashen Creek who remembered the original vanishings were either old or had moved away, desperate to escape the town's macabre reputation. A new generation had grown up with the chapel as a monolithic boogeyman on the edge of their world, a place dared only by the most reckless of teenage boys. The events of 1869 and 1875 were no longer treated as an unsolved crime, but as a confirmed supernatural event. The official narrative was that a demonic entity, or the vengeful spirit of the sour ground, had taken the brides. It was a simpler, more digestible horror than the alternative, that a human monster had walked among them undetected. Reverend Alistair Blackwood was still there, now a frail, white-haired old man. His once magnetic charisma had been replaced by a ghostly fragility. He was a living relic of the town's trauma, revered by some as a tragic, saintly figure, and avoided by others as an ill omen. He no longer preached, his voice having faded to a dry whisper. He lived a hermit's existence in a small cottage, his days spent reading the Bible and tending to his small garden. He rarely spoke of the past, and when he did, it was with a profound and distant sadness, as if recounting a terrible dream. The chapel, however, was about to claim one final victim. Not a bride this time, but a young woman driven by a journalist's ambition and a skeptic's disbelief. Her name was Alice Munro, a writer for a sensationalist Boston newspaper who had come to Kentucky to write a definitive account of the bride-taker curse. She believed the supernatural explanation was a cover for a far more mundane and solvable crime. She was determined to be the one to finally close this creepy, cold case. She had no idea that in prying open the past, she was about to unleash its last and most terrible secret. Alice Munro was a woman ahead of her time, sharp, cynical, and utterly dismissive of folklore. She arrived in Ashen Creek in the autumn of 1888, armed with a notepad, a healthy dose of skepticism, and a letter of introduction to the aged Sheriff Brody, who was now long retired and living out his days on a small pension. Brody was reluctant to speak of the past, the dual disappearances representing the greatest failure of his career. But Alice was persistent. She spent days with the old man, poring over his dusty, unofficial notes, listening to his weary recollections. She was the first person in years to treat the case as a puzzle to be solved, rather than a ghost story to be told. Brody, finding a spark of his old investigative spirit rekindled, began to help her in earnest. He gave her the names of everyone who had been present at both weddings. He recounted the dead ends of the Pinkerton investigation. He spoke of the strange, agitated behavior of the tracking dogs near the chapel foundation. This last detail snagged Alice's attention. Animals, she reasoned, are not susceptible to superstition. They react to physical stimuli. What could have been in or around that chapel to so thoroughly distress them? Her investigation inevitably led her to the reclusive Reverend Alastair Blackwood. She found him sitting on the porch of his small cottage, a gaunt figure wrapped in a thick wool blanket despite the mild autumn air. His eyes, sunken and clouded with age, seemed to look right through her. At first he refused to speak about the chapel, murmuring only of God's mysterious ways and sorrows too deep for words. But Alice was a skilled interviewer. She didn't press him on the supernatural. Instead, she asked him about the chapel's construction. She asked about the dark stone he had chosen, the design he had drawn, the long nights he had spent laying the foundation. As she asked these practical architectural questions, a flicker of something, not fear, not sadness, but something akin to pride, briefly illuminated the old man's deadened eyes. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible shift, but Alice saw it. And for the first time, a sliver of genuine, chilling suspicion began to form in her mind. The evil here wasn't in the ground or in the air. It was in the design. Alice Munro's focus shifted from the who of the crime to the how. The impossibility of the disappearances was the key. If you could solve the method, you would find the man. She became obsessed with the chapel's architecture. She obtained copies of the original land grant and the simple building proposal Blackwood had filed the county clerk decades earlier. The plans were rudimentary, showing little more than a basic floor plan, a nave, an altar, and the small, square vestry at the back. There was nothing to indicate any secret passages or hidden rooms. Yet the question remained, how did two women leave a sealed room? Convinced the answer lay within the building itself, Alice resolved to do what no one had done for over a decade: enter the forbidden chapel. Breaking the town's ban was no small matter. She enlisted the help of the blacksmith's son, a young man who was a boy when Alara Vance, a woman who would have been his aunt, had vanished. He, too, felt the pull of the unsolved mystery that haunted his family. Under the cover of a moonless night, they pried the heavy boards from the chapel doors. The sound of rotting wood groaning and snapping echoed in the dead, silent clearing. The air that rushed out from within was stale, thick with the smell of decay, dust, and something else. A faint, cloying sweetness like long-dead flowers. They stepped inside, their lantern casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe on the damp stone walls. The place was a ruin. Pews were overturned, covered in cobwebs and animal droppings. The altar was shrouded in a thick carpet of moss. But as they approached the back of the chapel, towards the vestry, Alice noticed something strange. The floor of the nave was made of wide, rough-hewn wooden planks. But the floor of the raised sanctuary area, around the altar and in front of the vestry door, was made of large, tightly fitted flagstones, the same cold, dark stone as the walls. Why the change in material? It was inefficient, expensive, and structurally unnecessary. As she ran her hand over the cold, smooth surface of the stone floor, a horrifying idea began to take shape in her mind. A theory of the crime so diabolical and macabre, it made the supernatural tales seem tame by comparison. Inside the derelict chapel, the silence was absolute, broken only by the dripping of water and the frantic beating of their own hearts. Alice Munro directed her companion's lantern towards the flagstone floor in front of the altar. She began to tap on each stone with the iron pry bar they had brought, listening intently to the sound. Most returned a solid, dead thud. But then, as she tapped on the largest stone, the one situated directly before the vestry door, the sound was different. It was still a thud, but it was deeper, resonant, with a faint, almost imperceptible echo. It was hollow. Her companion looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. Working together, they jammed the tip of the pry bar into the thin seam between the stones. It took their combined weight and several agonizing minutes of effort, but slowly, with a gut-wrenching screech of stone grinding against stone, the massive flagstone began to move. It didn't lift. It pivoted. A dark, rectangular opening was revealed, a black wound in the chapel floor. The air that rose from the hole was an assault on the senses, a wave of profound, subterranean cold, thick with the stench of rot, damp earth, and something sickeningly familiar, the smell of the grave. They lowered the lantern into the darkness. It illuminated a set of steep, crudely carved stone steps leading down into a small, cramped chamber directly beneath the vestry. It was a crypt, a hidden cellar no bigger than the room above it, and at the bottom of the steps, half submerged in the muddy floor, lay the truth. It was not the skeletons of the lost brides they saw first. It was something else, something that spoke to the meticulous, long-term planning of the monster who had built this place. Lined against one wall were two empty, rotting wooden coffins, waiting. This was not a makeshift prison. It was a purpose-built tomb, designed and excavated before the first prayer was ever uttered in the chapel above. Alice felt a wave of nausea and terror. The curse wasn't real. The horrifying truth was that the chapel hadn't claimed its brides. The man who built it had. The discovery of the hidden chamber transformed the creepy legend of Blackwood Chapel into the horrifying reality of a cold-blooded crime. But the most macabre discovery was yet to come. With trembling hands, Alice and the blacksmith's son lowered themselves into the cramped, foul-smelling crypt. The lantern light flickered across the damp stone walls, revealing tool marks, the scrape and gouge of a pickaxe and shovel. This tiny, secret room had been carved from the earth by hand. In one corner they found a small wooden chest, its lid swollen and warped by the damp. Prying it open, they found it filled not with treasure but with trophies. Inside lay a small, leather-bound Bible, its front page inscribed with the name Ilara Vance. Next to it was a single, elegant pearl earring, which the blacksmith's son recognized with a choked sob as belonging to Martha O'Connell. And beneath these items was a thick, leather-bound journal. The journal belonged to Reverend Alistair Blackwood. Its pages were filled with his neat, spidery script. It was not the diary of a man of God. It was the meticulous, deranged manifesto of a serial killer. Alice began to read excerpts aloud, her voice shaking in the suffocating darkness. Blackwood wrote of his wife's death not with sorrow, but with a twisted, consuming rage. He saw her slow, agonizing demise as a betrayal by the institution of marriage itself, a holy promise that led only to suffering and decay. He came to believe that true love, perfect and untarnished, could only exist in a single, fleeting moment, the moment just before a bride gives herself to a husband, to a life of inevitable corruption and death. In his shattered mind, he was not a murderer. He was a savior. He was preserving these young women, these perfect flowers, at the peak of their purity, saving them from the ugliness of life and the bitterness of death by granting them an eternal, untarnished martyrdom. He called them his stone angels. He was an artist, and this chapel, this tomb, was his gallery. This revelation, this glimpse into the depths of his methodical madness, was more terrifying than any ghost story. The journal detailed the horrifying mechanics of his crimes with chilling precision. The pivoting flagstone was the heart of his trap. He had designed and built the mechanism himself during the chapel's construction, working alone at night, his secret labors hidden from the townspeople who helped him by day. The stone was perfectly balanced, operable by a hidden lever concealed within the wall of the vestry. His method was deceptively simple. On the wedding day, he would enter the vestry to offer the bride a final prayer. During this intimate, emotional moment, he would ask her to kneel on a specific prayer cushion, which he had placed directly over the seam of the hidden door in the floor above the crypt. As she knelt, her back to him, her mind on her impending vows, he would release the lever. The stone would pivot, dropping the unsuspecting woman directly into the darkness of the chamber below. The fall was only a few feet, but it was enough to disorient and injure. Before she could scream or recover, he would be upon her, silencing her with a chloroform-soaked rag he kept prepared. The entire abduction took less than a minute. He would then slide the heavy stone back into place, the seal so perfect it was nearly invisible. He would then walk out of the vestry, retrieve his sermon book, and wait for the alarm to be raised, his face a perfect mask of concern and confusion. The plan was diabolical, audacious, and sickeningly effective. He had used his position of absolute trust, the sanctity of the moment, and the very architecture of his holy place to commit his horrifying acts. And with the entire community and later the Pinkerton detectives searching the woods for a runaway or an abductor, no one ever thought to look down, to consider that the brides had never left the chapel at all. They had simply been moved from one room to another, from the chapel to the tomb. The simplicity of it was as horrifying as the act itself. To hear about the most disturbing entry in Blackwood's journal and the fate of the brides is to understand the true depths of his madness. For those who can stomach such dark truths, we invite you to stay with us as the story reaches its grim conclusion. As Alice continued to read from the journal in the flickering lantern light, she reached the final, most disturbing entries. After abducting each bride, Blackwood did not kill them immediately. The crypt was not just a hiding place, it was a stage for his macabre obsession. He wrote that he would keep them alive in the darkness for several days, speaking to them through a small, concealed ventilation shaft. He didn't torture them physically. His cruelty was psychological. He would read them scripture, tell them they had been chosen by God for a special purpose, that they had been elevated beyond the mundane filth of mortal life. He was, in his mind, their priest, their confessor, their guide into a purer state of being. He described Alara's terror, then her eventual broken silence. He wrote of Martha's defiance, her screams and curses that eventually faded into weak sobs. He saw their despair not as a product of his monstrous cruelty, but as a necessary spiritual purification. When he decided their souls were cleansed, he would descend into the crypt one last time. He would dress them again in their wedding gowns, arrange their hair, and then, with a calm and methodical detachment, he would end their lives. His chosen method was strangulation, a silent and intimate act of violence. The journal contains a horrifyingly poetic passage describing his belief that he was not taking a life, but rather releasing the soul at the moment of its most perfect beauty, preserving it forever from the decay of age and the saplements of love. He would then place their bodies in the waiting coffins, sealing them not for burial, but for his own private worship. For years, he was the only one who knew that just a few feet beneath the altar where he preached of salvation, the rotting remains of his victims lay entombed. He had turned his house of God into a personal, subterranean mausoleum, a monument to his horrifying, blasphemous obsession. The scale of his deception, the depth of his psychosis, was beyond anything Alice or the blacksmith's son could have possibly imagined. The final, crucial question remained. Where were the bodies? The coffins in the crypt were empty and rotting. The journal provided the horrifying answer. Years after the murders, as Reverend Blackwood grew older and more paranoid, he became terrified that his secret would one day be discovered. The chapel, now abandoned and falling into ruin, was no longer a secure resting place for his stone angels. He feared grave robbers, or that the structure might collapse and reveal the chamber. Sometime in the early 1880s, under the cover of many moonless nights, he undertook his final, gruesome task. He opened the coffins. He removed the skeletal remains of Alara Vance and Martha O'Connell. Then, piece by piece, he carried their bones out of the chapel and into the deep woods. The journal described the location with chilling specificity. Beneath the great, lightning-scarred oak on Shadow Creek, where the sour ground drinks the deepest. He had not buried them in a grave. He had ground their bones into dust and mixed them with the mortar he used to seal the entrance to a small, natural cave he had found by the creek bed. He was not just hiding the evidence. He was performing a final, macabre ritual, making their remains a permanent, inseparable part of the cursed land itself. He was literally cementing his victims into the local folklore. This act revealed the final stage of his madness. He had succeeded in transforming his gruesome crimes into a ghost story, ensuring that any future discovery of the bones would be seen as proof of the supernatural legend, not of his own human evil. He had authored not just the crime, but the very myth that concealed it. Armed with this final, horrifying piece of information, Alice Munro and her companion left the chapel, the Reverend's journal clutched in her hand. They had found the truth. Now they had to unearth the proof. And they knew exactly where the old man was going to be. They emerged from the chapel into the pre-dawn gloom, the horrifying knowledge they possessed feeling like a physical weight. Their next stop was not the retired sheriff, but the cottage of Reverend Alistair Blackwood. They found him just as they had left him, a frail shape on his porch, rocking slowly in his chair as if waiting for them. The blacksmith's son, his face a mask of rage and grief, confronted him, demanding to know where his aunt was buried. But the old man was gone, his mind having finally retreated completely into the fog of dementia. He just smiled a gentle, vacant smile, humming a tuneless hymn. He didn't recognize them. He didn't seem to recognize anything. His judgment would not come from a court of law. Alice left the young man with the rambling reverend and went straight to the new sheriff, presenting him with the journal. The evidence was undeniable, the narrative too detailed and sick to be a work of fiction. A small posse was formed, and guided by the blacksmith's son, they made their way to the lightning-scarred oak by Shadow Creek. They found the small cave, its entrance sealed with a patch of mortar that was visibly different from the surrounding rock, newer and crudely applied. It took the men hours with sledgehammers and pickaxes to break through the stone and mortar seal. As they worked, they noticed tiny white fragments embedded within the binding agent itself. It was bone. When they finally broke through, they found the last missing pieces of the puzzle. Inside the small, dark cave were two rotting wedding gowns, yellowed and covered in mold but still recognizable, and with them a collection of personal items, a locket with a faded portrait of Silas Croft, a silver hairbrush engraved with the initials M.O., and other small trinkets that had been buried with the brides. The physical evidence was now absolute. The cold case that had haunted Ashen Creek for nearly 20 years was finally solved. The monster had a name, Reverend Alistair Blackwood. The revelation of Reverend Blackwood's crimes sent a shockwave of horror and revulsion through Ashen Creek and the entire nation. Alice Munro's newspaper articles, serialized over several weeks, became a national sensation. They were a lurid, detailed account of the vampire Reverend and his chapel of horrors. The public was captivated by the sheer, diabolical cunning of the man, his ability to hide such profound evil behind a mask of piety and grief for so many years. As he was the monster next door, the wolf who had not just dressed in sheep's clothing, but had built the very fold and appointed himself its shepherd. For the people of Ashen Creek, the truth was almost too much to bear. It was a deep, communal trauma. The families of Alara Vance and Martha O'Connell finally had an answer, but it was an answer so monstrous it offered little comfort. They had mourned their lost loved ones, believing them to be victims of a curse or a mysterious act of fate. To learn they had been systematically hunted, imprisoned, and murdered by a man they had trusted, a man who had comforted them in their grief, was a psychological wound from which the community would never fully recover. The legend of the cursed chapel died overnight, replaced by the far more sordid and terrifying truth of human depravity. The supernatural was, in a strange way, a more comforting explanation. A ghost or a demon is an external, otherworldly force, but Blackwood was one of them. He had shared their bread, blessed their children, and buried their dead, all while hiding his ghoulish secret just beneath their feet. The sense of betrayal was absolute, and it demanded an outlet. Alistair Blackwood, now lost to the world in his senility, was arrested but deemed unfit to stand trial. He was sent to a state asylum, where he lived out his few remaining years in silence, reportedly spending his days tracing the patterns of the stone walls of his cell. But the community's rage needed a target, and since they could not punish the man, they turned their fury on the monument he had built to his own madness, the chapel. The night after Blackwood's confession was published in full, a mob formed in Ashen Creek. They were not wild-eyed vigilantes. They were the fathers, brothers, and sons of the community, men whose families had been terrorized by the chapel's shadow for a generation. Their grief and fear had finally curdled into a cold, focused rage. Carrying torches and cans of kerosene, they marched through the woods, their silence more menacing than any shout. They were not there to riot. They were there to perform an execution. They surrounded Blackwood Chapel, the dark stone edifice seeming to soak up the torchlight, its presence a final, defiant insult. The men worked with a grim efficiency, splashing kerosene on the dry, rotting wood of the pews, the altar, and the heavy oak doors. They poured it down into the dark, open maw of the crypt, a final act of cleansing for the unholy ground. The blacksmith's son, the nephew of the first victim, was given the honor of casting the first torch. It sailed through the air in a fiery arc and landed on the altar with a whoosh. For a moment, the fire seemed hesitant, but then it caught, and a hungry orange flame roared to life inside the chapel. Within minutes, the entire structure was engulfed. The fire raged with an unnatural ferocity, as if all the darkness and sorrow trapped within its walls were finally being consumed. The heat was so intense it cracked the cold river stones of the walls, and the dissonant chapel bell, heated to a molten glow, fell from its tower with a final, mournful clang that echoed through the valley. The townspeople of Ashen Creek stood and watched until the roof collapsed and the steeple fell, until the last flame died down, leaving only a smoldering, blackened skeleton of stone walls beneath the dawn sky. They had not just destroyed a building. They were attempting to burn a memory, to cauterize a wound that had festered for 2 decades. They believed that with the chapel gone, the story would finally be over. But some stories, especially those born of such macabre deeds, never truly end. They simply seep into the ground, waiting. Even with the chapel reduced to a smoldering ruin and its monstrous creator locked away, the story refused to die. The very act of burning the chapel, intended to erase its memory, instead immortalized it. The site became an even greater source of morbid curiosity. Relic hunters and thrill-seekers began to make pilgrimages to Ashen Creek, hoping to find a charred piece of wood or a cracked stone from the infamous Murder Chapel. Alice Munro's articles were compiled into a best-selling book, a lurid and sensationalist tome that cemented the story in the annals of American true crime. The tale of Reverend Blackwood became a new kind of folklore, a warning not about ghosts, but about the darkness that can hide in the human heart. The town of Ashen Creek, however, wanted nothing more than to forget. They rebuilt their community around a determined silence. The name Blackwood was never spoken. Newcomers were not told the story. The path to the chapel ruins was blocked, and the land was sold to a timber company with the implicit understanding that it would never be developed. For generations, the town was successful in burying its past. The ruins of the chapel were slowly reclaimed by the forest, the blackened stones covered by decades of leaves and soil, until almost nothing remained to mark the spot. The story faded from a national sensation into a regional whisper, a creepy old tale that locals knew but rarely shared. The cold case had been solved, the monster identified, the building destroyed. It seemed, for all intents and purposes, that the tale had reached its conclusion. But the sour ground of Ashen Creek held one last, horrifying secret. A final, macabre postscript that would not be discovered until more than a century later. A discovery that would suggest that perhaps the townsfolk had been right to fear the land all along, and that Reverend Blackwood's evil may have been just one part of a much older, much darker story. The years passed. The 19th century gave way to the 20th. World wars came and went. The town of Ashen Creek modernized, but it never fully escaped the shadow of its past. The land where the chapel once stood remained untouched, a patch of old-growth forest that local loggers and developers instinctively avoided. The story was still there, but it had lost its sharp edges, softened by time into a vague and cautionary legend. Then, in 2008, a university archaeological team, conducting a survey of early Appalachian settlements, came to the area. They had read of the Blackwood Chapel in historical archives and were interested in locating the original site. Using old maps and Alice Munro's detailed descriptions, they were able to pinpoint the location of the clearing. now so overgrown it was nearly unrecognizable. They began a small, exploratory excavation, expecting to find little more than the charred stone foundation of the chapel. They found the foundation, a perfect, blackened rectangle of stone hidden just beneath the topsoil. They also located the collapsed-in remains of the crypt. But as they expanded their dig site, mapping the perimeter of the original clearing, they found something else. Something that was not on any of the chapel's plans. Something that was far, far older. Just beyond the footprint of the chapel's foundation, buried deeper in the earth, they uncovered a series of graves. They were not Christian burials. The bodies were interred in a fetal position, a practice associated with certain pre-colonial Native American tribes of the region. But there was something deeply disturbing about these remains. There were a dozen skeletons in all, and every single one of them was female. Forensic analysis would later reveal that they were all young women between the ages of 15 and 25, and each skeleton showed evidence of a violent, ritualistic death. This discovery was horrifying. It suggested that Blackwood Chapel had been built atop a site of ancient, serial murder. The discovery of the ancient gravesite sent a chill through the archaeological team and the few local historians who were aware of the dig. The implications were staggering. Was it possible that the horrifying events of the 19th century were not an isolated anomaly, but rather an echo of a much older cycle of violence? Was there something about this specific piece of land, this sour ground, as the old legends called it, that attracted or created such monsters? The forensic reports on the ancient remains were deeply unsettling. The pattern of death was eerily similar across all 12 skeletons, suggesting the work of a single killer or a consistent ritual over many years. The historical record was scoured for any information about the tribe that had inhabited the area, but the specific group was long extinct, their history lost. There were only the vague, passed-down legends from other tribes about a splinter clan that had been cast out for practicing dark medicine and blood worship. The archaeologists began to speculate. Could Reverend Alastair Blackwood, a man already predisposed to madness and violence, have been somehow influenced by the history of the land he chose for his chapel? He had spent months, even years, on that ground, digging its earth, shaping its stone. Was it possible that in his obsessive, solitary labor, he had unearthed some evidence of the previous murders? Perhaps he had found one of the old graves, and the discovery, filtered through his own twisted theology and grief, had acted as a catalyst, planting the seed of the horrifying idea that would later consume him. It was a terrifying thought, that Blackwood was not the originator of the evil, but merely its inheritor. He was a new priest for an old, bloodthirsty god that had long resided in that dark hollow. The narrative of a simple, though monstrous, human killer was suddenly complicated by a far more ancient and macabre possibility. The evil of Blackwood Chapel might not have started with the laying of its foundation, but might have been soaked into the very soil upon which it was built. This new, disturbing layer to the story recontextualized everything. The local superstitions, once dismissed as rustic folklore, suddenly seemed like a kind of ancestra. El memory, a warning passed down through generations about a place that was inherently wrong. The Cherokee who avoided the sour ground, the tracking dogs who whined and refused to approach the chapel walls, the pervasive sense of dread that even casual visitors reported. Perhaps these were not reactions to a ghost story, but to a genius loci, a malevolent spirit of place that had been there for centuries. This theory, while impossible to prove, cast a deeply disturbing light on Blackwood's actions. His journal, which had been preserved in a university archive, was re-examined. In it, he described his selection of the chapel site as a moment of divine inspiration. He wrote, "I was led to a clearing in the woods where the silence was not empty but full. It was a weighted silence, as if the ground itself was listening. I knew at once this was a place of great power, a place where heaven and earth were thinly veiled. At the time, this was interpreted as the poetic rambling of a religious man. But now it read like the testimony of a man unknowingly drawn to a site of ancient evil. Had he felt its power? Had he misinterpreted a dark terrestrial energy as a divine calling? The most horrifying part of this theory is its implication of a recurring pattern, the land itself as a catalyst for murder. It suggests that Alistair Blackwood was not a unique monster, but simply the next in a line. It poses a chilling, unanswerable question. Who was the first? And who, had the chapel not been destroyed, might have been the next? The story of Blackwood Chapel had become more than a 19th-century cold case. It had become a modern American horror story, a tale of a cursed place that seemed to actively create its own monsters. The evil was not just in the man, or even in the stones he used to build his trap. The evil was in the earth itself. The story of the chapel that claimed every bride has over time become a complex tapestry of fact and folklore, of documented crime and supernatural speculation. It is a story with three distinct layers of horror. The first is the surface layer, the legend of the cursed chapel, a simple, terrifying ghost story born of fear and uncertainty. The second and most documented layer is the horrifying truth of Reverend Alistair Blackwood, a human monster whose calculated cruelty and psychological depravity are in many ways more terrifying than any supernatural entity. His methodical planning, his abuse of trust, and the sheer audacity of his crimes serve as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a veneer of civilization and piety. His journal remains one of the most disturbing documents in the annals of American crime, a direct window into the mind of a predator who believed himself a savior. But it is the third layer, the discovery of the ancient graves, that is perhaps the most profoundly unsettling. It suggests that the evil of Ashen Creek might be a geological feature, a permanent stain on the landscape. This idea taps into a deeper, more primal fear, the fear that some places are just fundamentally wrong, and that human evil is not always a choice, but can sometimes be a response to a dark invitation from the world itself. This final layer leaves the story without a neat conclusion. It elevates a sordid true crime tale into something far more mysterious and macabre. It ensures that the Blackwood Chapel case will never truly be closed. Because if the land itself is the culprit, how can justice ever be served? You can burn the building, lock away the man, but you cannot destroy the ground. And if that ground is still waiting, still listening, then the story of the Ashen Creek brides may not be over. It may just be in between chapters. If you find these deep dives into America's darkest and most forbidden histories compelling, support our work by subscribing. The shadows of the past are long, and there are many more creepy tales to unearth. Let us return for a moment to that final night in 1888, after Alice Munro had uncovered the truth. What became of the key players in this macabre drama? Alice herself became a celebrity journalist, but she was haunted for the rest of her life by what she had found in that dark, damp crypt. She never wrote another story with the same sensationalist flair. Her later work was somber, reflective, often exploring the psychological toll of violence on communities. She reportedly suffered from terrible nightmares and an aversion to churches, and died in 1929, a recluse who had seen too much of the darkness that lies beneath the surface of the world. The blacksmith's son, whose name history has largely forgotten, remained in Ashen Creek. He took over his father's business and became a respected, though notably silent and somber, member of the community. He never married. It was said that he could never again bring himself to stand at an altar, the association with the chapel's hidden horrors being too profound. He was the living embodiment of T. Town's trauma, a man whose family was at both the beginning and the end of the horrifying saga. And what of the grooms? Silas Croft, who was to marry Elara Vance, left Ashen Creek shortly after her disappearance, unable to bear the constant suspicion and the grief-soaked memories. He moved west and was never heard from again. The fiancé of Martha O'Connell, a promising lawyer from a wealthy family, had a more public and tragic end. He suffered a complete mental breakdown after her vanishing and the subsequent failure of the Pinkerton investigation. He spent the rest of his life in and out of institutions, forever obsessed with the unsolvable puzzle of her disappearance. never knowing that the man who had pretended to comfort him was the very architect of his misery. The story of the chapel did not just claim the lives of the brides. It cast a long, dark shadow that withered the lives of all it touched, a ripple of sorrow and madness spreading out from that cursed spot in the woods. The physical artifacts of the Blackwood Chapel case are few, but what remains is deeply unsettling. The Reverend's journal, with its spidery script and horrifyingly lucid prose, is held at the Historical Society archives of the State University. It is not on public display. Access is restricted to academic researchers and law enforcement personnel studying the psychology of serial offenders. Those who have read it describe the experience as profoundly disturbing, reporting a palpable sense of malevolence emanating from the aged pages. The few personal items recovered from the cave, the locket, the hairbrush, were returned to the families of the victims and presumably buried with the remains that were eventually interred in a proper Christian cemetery, far from Ashen Creek. The site of the ruins itself is now on private property, owned by a logging corporation that has, for over a century, honored the unspoken agreement to leave that particular patch of forest untouched. Local lore claims that cameras malfunction near the clearing, that compasses spin, and that electronic devices mysteriously lose their charge. While likely just modern embellishments on an old legend, these stories serve to maintain the site's forbidden aura. Perhaps the most chilling artifact is not an object but a sound. The chapel bell, which fell from the burning tower, was recovered from the ashes. It was cracked and warped by the intense heat. It was purchased by a collector of macabre oddities in the early 20th century. According to the collector's records, the bell was hung on his estate but had to be taken down. It had a habit of tolling on its own, not in the wind but on still, quiet nights. And the sound it made was not the clear, resonant tone of a church bell, but a discordant, mournful clang, the same unsettling note that had so disturbed the people of Ashen Creek when the chapel was first built. It was as if the sorrow and terror of its history had been permanently forged into its very metal. One of the most enduring and disturbing questions in the Blackwood Chapel case is, were there other victims? Blackwood's journal details only the murders of Alara Vance and Martha O'Connell. His obsession seemed specifically focused on the purity of brides at the moment of their wedding. However, his residency in Ashen Creek spanned over 2 decades, and the period between the 2 documented murders was 6 years. It seems psychologically improbable that a predator of such methodical intensity would remain dormant for so long. The archaeological dig in 2008, while focused on the ancient graves, also did a ground-penetrating radar survey of the wider area around the chapel clearing. The results were inconclusive, but noted several anomalies, disturbances in the soil that were not consistent with natural rock formations or root systems. These could be anything, of course: animal burrows, decomposing tree stumps, or they could be unmarked graves. In the years after the truth about Blackwood was revealed, several old, forgotten missing persons cases from the region were quietly re-examined. There was a young woman who vanished while picking berries in those woods in 1872. There was a traveler on the Old Ridge Road who disappeared in 1878. No evidence ever linked Blackwood to these cases, and they remain unsolved. But the possibility lingers, a dark and horrifying thought. Were Alara and Martha just the 2 he chose to document, the centerpieces of his macabre collection? Could there have been others, victims he deemed less significant, whose disappearances were simply attributed to the dangers of the wilderness? We will never know for sure. His journal is the only testimony, and a killer's diary is a notoriously unreliable narrator. It's a final, chilling ambiguity in a story full of them. The official victim count is 2. But in the sour ground of Ashen Creek, there may be more secrets yet to be unearthed. The Psychology of Alastair Blackwood presents a terrifying portrait of narcissistic psychopathy filtered through a religious lens. He was not a rabid, disorganized killer. He was patient, meticulous, and incredibly disciplined. The construction of the chapel and its hidden trap required years of careful planning and secret labor. His ability to maintain a public persona of a gentle, grieving pastor while secretly carrying out these monstrous acts speaks to a profound and complete disconnect from empathy and reality. He was, in the clinical sense, a monster. Criminologists who have studied the case believe his wife's death from consumption was the trigger but not the cause of his pathology. The underlying psychopathy was likely always there, dormant. Her slow, wasting death, a process he could not control, may have created in him an obsessive need to control the life and death of others. He fixated on brides, the ultimate symbols of life, hope, and a future he felt had been stolen from him. In his twisted logic, he wasn't destroying them. He was perfecting them, freezing them in time at their most beautiful moment, saving them from the inevitable decay and suffering his own wife had endured. This is a common feature in certain types of serial offenders, the belief that they are doing their victims a favor, a messianic complex that allows them to justify the most horrifying acts. Blackwood saw himself as an agent of God, performing a holy, if misunderstood, sacrament. He was both the priest and the angel of death. This combination of methodical planning, a messiah complex, and a complete lack of remorse makes him one of the most uniquely disturbing figures in the history of American crime. He was not just a killer, he was a theologian of murder, a man who built a temple to his own horrifying obsession. The story of Blackwood Chapel has had a lasting, though quiet, impact on popular culture. While not as famous as H. Holmes's Murder Castle, the tale has surfaced in various forms. It's whispered to have been a partial inspiration for several Gothic horror novels and short stories from the early 20th century, particularly those dealing with themes of tainted holy places and predatory, charismatic figures. The trope of a killer priest, or a cursed church in horror fiction, owes a small, unacknowledged debt to the real-life horror of Ashen Creek. The case has been the subject of numerous true crime podcasts and television documentaries, each one re-examining the sparse evidence and the chilling words of Blackwood's journal. In the world of paranormal investigation, the site of the chapel ruins is considered a holy grail, a place where the confluence of ancient ritual murder and modern, systematic evil has created what many believe to be a powerful and malevolent haunting. Teams of ghost hunters, often trespassing on the private land, have recorded dozens of hours of audio and video from the clearing. They claim to have captured EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, of a woman weeping, and shadowy figures darting between the trees on thermal cameras. While these claims are, of course, unsubstantiated and likely the result of suggestion and pareidolia, they speak to the story's enduring power. The tale is so inherently macabre, so perfectly structured as a horror narrative, that people feel a deep-seated need for there to be a supernatural element. The truth of human evil is, for many, a less palatable and far more frightening explanation than the idea that the bride's spirits are still lingering, forever trapped in the place where their hopes and their lives were so horrifically stolen from them. Comparing the Blackwood Chapel case to other historical crimes reveals its unique and horrifying character. Unlike Jack the Ripper, whose identity remains a mystery, we know who the Ashen Creek killer was. The horror comes not from the unknown, but from the intimately known, the trusted figure at the heart of the community. Unlike the public spectacle of the Murder Castle at the Chicago World's Fair, Blackwood's crimes were carried out in absolute secrecy and isolation, his evil hidden not in a bustling city, but in a quiet, forgotten hollow. The case is a chilling example of what criminologists call geographic profiling. Blackwood's hunting ground was a single, fixed location, his own chapel. He didn't stalk his victims through the streets. He created a place that would lure them to him, a place where they would be at their most vulnerable, their guard completely down. This makes the chapel itself a unique element in criminal history. It was simultaneously the weapon, the crime scene, and the tomb. The psychological component is also distinct. While many serial killers collect trophies, Blackwood's entire methodology was a form of ritualized, psychological trophy-taking. He wasn't just killing for pleasure. He was attempting to create a perfect, eternal moment, a kind of macabre religious art. He was a performance artist whose medium was murder and whose audience was himself and his God. This fusion of meticulous engineering, psychological manipulation, and blasphemous theology makes the Blackwood Chapel case a singularly disturbing chapter in the study of human darkness. It is a story that defies easy categorization, sitting at a creepy intersection of true crime, religious horror, and American Gothic folklore. What lessons, if any, can be drawn from this horrifying tale? Perhaps the most obvious is a dark commentary on the nature of trust and deception. Alistair Blackwood was able to commit his crimes precisely because he occupied a position of unimpeachable authority and trust. He weaponized piety, turning the sacred rituals of marriage and prayer into a predator's tools. The story serves as a grim reminder that the most monstrous evil often wears the most respectable mask. It also speaks to the power of narrative. For decades, the community of Ashen Creek preferred the supernatural narrative of a curse to the human one. The idea of a hungry chapel, while terrifying, was somehow less intimate, less violating than the idea of a killer in their midst. It's a testament to our psychological need to distance ourselves from the reality of human evil, to project it onto ghosts and demons, rather than confront the fact that the monster can be one of our own. Finally, the story is a profound meditation on place and memory. The destruction of the chapel and the town's long silence could not erase what happened there. The evil of the event seeped into the ground, becoming a permanent part of the landscape's identity. It shows that some histories cannot be buried. They fester. They linger as folklore, as ghost stories, as a permanent scar on the collective memory of a place. The sour ground of Ashen Creek remains a testament to this fact. A quiet, overgrown corner of Kentucky that stands as a permanent monument to a series of crimes so macabre. They blurred the line between cold case and campfire tale. Today, if you were to try and find the location of Blackwood Chapel, you would have a difficult time. There are no signs, no markers. The locals, if they are willing to speak of it at all, will give you vague, dismissive directions. The logging company that owns the land does not grant permission to visit. The site is being deliberately, actively forgotten. But if you were to find it, pushing your way through the dense, tangled undergrowth, you would eventually come to a small, unnatural clearing. The air here is still, the sunlight seems muted, and the forest sounds, the birds, the insects, fall away into an unnerving silence. You would see nothing but trees and earth. But if you looked closely at the ground beneath your feet, you might notice them, dark gray stones half buried in the soil, arranged in a faint rectangular outline. The foundation. The last remnant of the chapel, the footprint of a monster's obsession. There is nothing else left to see. No ruin, no memorial, no warning. There is only the silence, and the profound, unsettling feeling of being in a place where a terrible secret was kept for a very long time. It is a place that feels hollowed out, a vacuum where joy and prayer once were, now filled only with the weight of a dark and forbidden history. Standing there, in the oppressive quiet of the Kentucky woods, it's not hard to imagine the dissonant toll of a chapel bell, or the faint sound of a woman weeping on the wind. It's not hard to believe that the ground here is indeed sour, saturated with a sorrow that will never wash away. The story of the chapel that claimed its brides ends here, not with a resolution, but with a lingering, chilling echo. It is a cold case that was solved, yet remains deeply mysterious. The how and the who were discovered in a dusty journal, but the why remains locked in the impenetrable madness of a long-dead man and perhaps in the ancient memory of the land itself. The tale serves as a horrifying testament to the idea that the most terrifying stories are often the true ones. They don't require ghosts or demons to be scary. The methodical, patient evil of a single human being is, and always will be, the most profound horror of all. Alistair Blackwood did more than murder two women. He murdered the very idea of sanctuary. He took a place of hope and turned it into a tomb. He took the sacred vows of marriage and turned them into a death sentence. And in the end, his story, like the dark stone chapel he built, has become a permanent, unsettling fixture in the landscape of our darkest history. A forbidden tale from a quiet Kentucky hollow, a warning that the ground beneath our feet sometimes holds secrets, and that the devil is often closest when we are on our knees to pray.